I remember the day I brought up the idea of a joint account like it was yesterday. Mark and I were sitting on our worn-out couch in our tiny Brooklyn apartment, the sounds of the city filtering through the thin walls. The TV was on, playing some rerun of Friends, but neither of us was really watching. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, turning the idea over in my mind like a worried stone. "Hey, babe," I said, muting the TV. "What do you think about us opening a joint account?" Mark looked at me, his dark eyebrows furrowing slightly. "A joint account? I don't know, Ko. Isn't that something old married couples do?" I laughed, nudging him with my elbow. "Come on, we've been together for 3 years. We're practically an old married couple already." He smiled, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. I pressed on, my enthusiasm growing with each word. "Think about it. We could save for our future together. That house we've been dreaming about. It could be a reality. Maybe even kids someday, if we want them. And imagine being able to travel without worrying about money." As I spoke, I could see Mark's expression softening. I took his hand, feeling the calluses from his work as a carpenter. "It's our money," I said softly. "Our future." Finally, he nodded. "Okay, let's do it." I was over the moon. The next day, I went to our local bank on my lunch break. The teller, a friendly woman named Sarah, helped me set everything up. As I signed the papers, I felt a surge of excitement. This was it, the first step towards our future together. Over the next few months, I threw myself into saving. Every paycheck, I'd carefully budget our expenses, always making sure to set aside a chunk for our joint account. I'd check the balance almost daily, watching with pride as the numbers grew. Mark would often tease me about it. "There goes the accountant," he'd say with a grin as I pored over our budget spreadsheet. I'd stick my tongue out at him, but secretly, I loved the nickname. It made me feel responsible, adult. But looking back, I can see the warning signs I chose to ignore. Whenever I'd try to talk to Mark about our finances, he'd become evasive. "Don't worry about it, babe," he'd say, changing the subject. "It's all in the fund, right?" I'd nod, pushing down the nagging feeling in my gut. I told myself he just wasn't interested in the details, that he trusted me to handle it. Now, I wonder if I was just seeing what I wanted to see. Our life together wasn't perfect, but whose is? We had our routines. Mark would leave early for work, his toolbox clanking as he headed out the door. I'd kiss him goodbye, then get ready for my job at the marketing firm. In the evenings, we'd take turns cooking dinner, laughing over silly TV shows or planning our dream vacations. Weekends were my favorite. We'd explore the city, finding hidden gems in the maze of New York streets. There was this little Italian place in the East Village, Mamma Rosa's, that became our go-to spot for date nights. The owner, an old Italian lady who insisted we call her Nonna, would always greet us with a warm smile and extra breadsticks. It was during one of these dinners that we really started talking about buying a house. We were sharing a plate of spaghetti, the candlelight flickering between us, when Mark brought it up. "So, how much have we saved up?" he asked, twirling pasta around his fork. I beamed, proud of our progress. "We're getting close to 6 figures, I said. "If we keep this up, we could have enough for a down payment in a few months." Mark's eyes widened. "Wow, that much? You've been working hard." I reached across the table, taking his hand. "We've been working hard," I corrected him. "This is our dream, remember?" He nodded, squeezing my hand. "Yeah, our dream." That night, as we walked home hand in hand, the city lights twinkling around us, I felt on top of the world. We were so close to making our dreams a reality. I imagined us in our own home, with a little backyard where we could have barbecues in the summer. Maybe we'd get a dog, one of those big friendly ones that would play fetch for hours. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was a chilly Friday evening when everything changed. I remember it clearly, the sounds of traffic outside, the smell of the lasagna I'd put in the oven, the gentle hum of our ancient radiator. I was sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by papers. It was time to start seriously looking at houses, and I wanted to have all our finances in order. Excited about the prospect of finally using our hard-earned savings, I logged into our joint account. That's when I saw it. The balance that should have been 6 figures was now just $3.48. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. I refreshed the page, logged out and back in, but the number didn't change. My heart started racing, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This couldn't be happening. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone to call Mark. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, leaving increasingly panicked messages. "Mark, please call me back. There's something wrong with our account. I need to talk to you." Hours passed. The lasagna in the oven burned, filling the apartment with an acrid smell, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the computer screen, willing the numbers to change, and my phone, praying for it to ring. When I finally heard the key in the lock, I jumped up. Mark walked in, looking carefree as ever. The contrast between his relaxed demeanor and the turmoil I'd been experiencing made me feel sick. "Mark," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was checking our account. Did something happen? There's no money left. The entire account is empty." I watched as his expression changed. The carefree look vanished, replaced by something I'd never seen before, a mix of anger and defiance that made me take a step back. "Are you seriously accusing me of something?" he spat, his voice rising. "How dare you talk to me about money like I'm irresponsible?" Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, his hand struck me hard in the stomach. The force of it knocked the wind out of me, and I crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Mark loomed over me, his face contorted with rage. "I spent it on my mother and sister, okay? They deserved the trip of a lifetime. And guess what? I'll spend it how I like. You don't control me." With that, he stepped over me like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture, slamming the door as he left. I lay there on the cold tile floor, struggling to breathe, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The dream of togetherness that I'd held onto so tightly had shattered in an instant, leaving me alone with the bitter taste of betrayal and the harsh reality of what our relationship had become. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the apartment, seeming to reverberate through my very bones as I lay there on the cold kitchen floor. For what felt like hours, I couldn't move. The physical pain from Mark's blow was intense, but it paled in comparison to the emotional agony that engulfed me. As I finally managed to push myself up into a sitting position, leaning against the kitchen cabinets, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The man I loved, the man I had trusted with my heart and my future, had not only stolen from me but had physically attacked me. The betrayal was so profound, so all-encompassing, that I felt as if I was drowning in it. I don't know how long I sat there, arms wrapped around my knees, rocking back and forth. The lasagna I had put in the oven earlier was now a charred mess, its acrid smell filling the apartment. It seemed oddly fitting, another dream turned to ashes. As the shock began to wear off, other emotions started to flood in. Anger, fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of shame battled for dominance. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed the signs? The evasiveness when I talked about money, the occasional flashes of temper that I'd brushed off as stress from work, it all seemed so obvious now, in hindsight. I finally managed to stand, wincing at the pain in my abdomen. Stumbling to the bathroom, I lifted my shirt to inspect the damage. A large, angry bruise was already forming, a physical reminder of the emotional wounds inflicted tonight. As I stared at my reflection in the mirror, I hardly recognized the person looking back at me. My eyes were red and puffy from crying, my face pale with shock. This broken, betrayed woman couldn't be me, could it? But it was. And as I stood there, meeting my own gaze in the mirror, something shifted inside me. A spark of defiance ignited, small at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. I had done nothing wrong. I had loved, trusted, and worked hard for our future. Mark was the one who had betrayed that trust, who had thrown away our dreams for his own selfish desires. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. I had several missed calls from work. I had completely forgotten about the late-night meeting I was supposed to attend. There were also a few texts from friends, asking if Mark and I wanted to meet up for drinks later. The normalcy of these messages felt surreal in the face of how drastically my life had changed in the last few hours. I thought about calling someone, my best friend, Lisa, or maybe my sister. But what would I say? How could I possibly explain what had happened when I could barely understand it myself? The shame welled up again, threatening to overwhelm me. What would they think of me? Would they blame me for not seeing this coming? Instead, I found myself opening the banking app again, staring at that damning balance of $3.48. Swallowing hard, I started scrolling through the transaction history. There it was, a series of large withdrawals over the past month, culminating in one final, massive transfer that had drained the account completely. Each transaction felt like a fresh betrayal, a testament to how thoroughly Mark had deceived me. As I looked at the dates of the withdrawals, memories surfaced. The day of the largest withdrawal coincided with the evening Mark had come home late, full of apologies and bearing an expensive bouquet of roses. "Just because I love you," he had said. Now I understood, it had been a distraction, a way to keep me from checking the account. Another withdrawal lined up with the weekend. He had insisted on a spontaneous road trip. We had driven up to a quaint bed and breakfast in the Catskills, and he had been unusually extravagant, ordering the most expensive wines and suggesting activities that were normally out of our budget. At the time, I had been thrilled, seeing it as a romantic gesture. Now, the memory was tainted, another calculated move in his grand deception. The more I delved into the transaction history, the more my anger grew. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness. This was calculated, long-term fraud. Mark had been systematically stealing from me, from us, for months. And all the while, he had played the role of the loving partner perfectly. A new thought struck me, sending a chill down my spine. What if this had been his plan all along? Had our entire relationship been a lie? I thought back to the early days, when we first met at a mutual friend's barbecue. Mark had been charming, attentive, always saying the right things. Had it all been an act, a long con with the end goal of taking my money? No, I couldn't believe that. The Mark I fell in love with, the man who held me when I cried over losing my job 2 years ago, the partner who nursed me through a brutal bout of flu, that person had to have been real. Didn't he? But then again, I never would have believed the Mark I knew could do this either. Doubt crept in, coloring every memory, every moment we had shared. Our first kiss in Central Park, the nights spent planning our future, the lazy Sunday mornings making pancakes together. Had it all been a lie? As the night wore on, I found myself moving through the apartment in a daze. Every corner held a memory, and each one now felt tainted. The framed photo of us on the bookshelf, grinning widely on a beach in Mexico. Had he been thinking about how to steal from me even then? The guitar in the corner that I had gifted him for his birthday last year. Had he been playing me for a fool with every song? I couldn't bear to sleep in our bed. Instead, I curled up on the couch, wrapping myself in the throw blanket my grandmother had knitted for us as a housewarming gift. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind raced. What was I going to do now? All of my savings were gone. The dream of buying a house had evaporated. Even paying next month's rent seemed like an insurmountable challenge. More than that, what was I going to do about Mark? The rational part of my brain knew I should call the police, report the theft and the assault. But the thought of actually doing it made me feel physically ill. Despite everything, there was still a small, foolish part of me that loved him, that wanted to believe this was all some terrible mistake. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I hadn't slept a wink. My eyes were dry and burning, my head pounding from a night of tears and turmoil. But as I watched the sun rise over the New York skyline, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a sense of calm began to settle over me. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't go back and undo my trust in Mark, or magically refill our bank account. But I could decide what happened next. I could choose how to respond to this betrayal. Slowly, I sat up, wincing at the stiffness in my muscles and the persistent ache where Mark had struck me. I made my way to the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making coffee. As the rich aroma filled the air, I felt my mind beginning to clear. I couldn't stay here, in this apartment filled with memories and lies. I needed space to think, to plan my next move. As I sipped my coffee, I made a decision. I would pack a bag, take what money I had left in my personal account, and check into a cheap motel for a few days. I needed time to process everything that had happened and figure out my next steps. As I moved through the apartment, gathering essentials and stuffing them into a duffel bag, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was still pain, anger, and betrayal, but underneath it all, a new feeling was emerging: determination. Mark had underestimated me. He thought he could take everything from me and walk away unscathed. He was wrong. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Mark had made a grave mistake in betraying me, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. As I zipped up my bag and took one last look around the apartment, I made a silent promise to myself. I would rebuild my life, with or without Mark. And I would find a way to get justice, not just for the money he stole, but for the trust he had shattered and the dreams he had destroyed. With a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind me, and with it, I closed a chapter of my life. What lay ahead was uncertain, scary even, but for the first time since I had seen that devastating bank balance, I felt a glimmer of hope. This was not the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new one. The lobby of the Sunset Motel was dimly lit and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, despite the no smoking sign prominently displayed behind the front desk. The night clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a worn Yankees cap, barely looked up from his magazine as I approached. "One room, please," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. "Just for a few nights." He grunted, sliding a key across the scratched Formica counter. "Room 112. Down the hall, to the left." I nodded my thanks, hefting my duffel bag onto my shoulder. The weight of it, filled with hastily packed clothes and whatever essentials I could grab, seemed to mirror the heaviness in my chest. The room was small and sparse, with faded floral wallpaper and a bed that had seen better days. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was far away from the apartment I shared with Mark. As I sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the past 24 hours washed over me again. I pulled out my phone, staring at the black screen. I had turned it off before leaving the apartment, unable to bear the thought of Mark trying to contact me. Now, with shaking hands, I powered it on. As notifications began to flood in, I felt a mix of dread and hope. Had Mark realized what he'd done? Was he sorry? But as I scrolled through the messages, my heart sank. There were concerned texts from friends, wondering why I hadn't shown up for our planned drinks. A voicemail from my boss, asking about the missed meeting. But nothing from Mark. Not a single word. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't sorry. He didn't care. To him, I was just a means to an end, a convenient source of money to be used and discarded. For a moment, I felt the urge to call him, to demand answers, to scream and cry and beg him to tell me it was all a mistake. But as my finger hovered over his contact, a memory flashed through my mind. The look of cold fury in his eyes as he stood over me, his words dripping with contempt. "You don't control me." No. I couldn't call him. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing how much he'd hurt me. Instead, I found myself dialing another number, one I knew by heart but hadn't called in far too long. "Hello." The familiar voice of my old college roommate, Lisa, filled me with an unexpected sense of comfort. "Lisa," I said, my voice cracking. I need help." There must have been something in my tone, because Lisa's response was immediate and filled with concern. "Ko, what's wrong? Are you okay?" And just like that, the dam broke. Words poured out of me in a jumbled rush, the whole sordid tale spilling forth. The joint account, the missing money, Mark's violence, my flight from our shared apartment. Through it all, Lisa listened, only occasionally murmuring words of sympathy and support. When I finally fell silent, emotionally spent, Lisa's voice was firm and resolute. "Ko, listen to me. What Mark did, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. This is theft and assault. You need to report this." I felt a flash of panic at the thought. "I can't, Lisa. What if no one believes me? What if stop?" Lisa cut me off gently. "I believe you. And I'm a lawyer, remember? We can fight this." But first, you need to document everything. The bruises, the bank statements, everything. Can you do that for me? I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. Yes, I said softly. I can do that. After hanging up with Lisa, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and energy. My body ached for sleep, but my mind was racing with everything I needed to do. Following Lisa's advice, I started by taking photos of the bruise on my stomach, wincing at how dark and angry it looked in the harsh motel lighting. Next, I logged into my banking app, downloading statements and screenshots of the transactions. Each withdrawal felt like a fresh betrayal, but I forced myself to document everything meticulously. As I worked, memories of my relationship with Mark kept surfacing. The day we met at our friend Jake's 4th of July barbecue, how he'd made me laugh with his terrible attempts at grilling. Our first date at that quirky little bookstore cafe in the village, where we'd talked for hours over cooling cups of coffee. The night he'd surprised me with a homemade dinner after a particularly grueling day at work, the kitchen a disaster but his smile so proud and loving. Had it all been a lie? A carefully constructed facade designed to gain my trust and access to my finances? The thought made me feel physically ill. But as I continued to gather evidence, another feeling began to grow alongside the pain and betrayal. Anger. Not the hot, destructive rage I'd felt in the immediate aftermath of Mark's attack, but a cold, focused fury. How dare he do this to me? How dare he steal not just my money, but my trust, my love, my sense of security? I thought about all the times I'd put my own needs and desires aside for the sake of our shared future. The promotion I'd turned down because it would have meant relocating, moving away from Mark's job. The countless hours I'd spent budgeting and saving, while Mark went out for drinks with his co-workers. The dreams I'd shared with him, the vulnerabilities I'd exposed, believing we were building a life together. Well, no more. I was done being a victim. Mark had underestimated me, clearly believing I would be too shocked, too ashamed to fight back. He was wrong. With renewed determination, I opened my laptop and began to research. Financial fraud, domestic violence resources, legal aid. I absorbed it all, making notes and bookmarking pages. The more I learned, the more my confidence grew. I wasn't powerless. I had options. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the thin motel curtains, I finally allowed myself to rest. Curling up on the lumpy mattress, I felt a strange sense of calm. The road ahead would be difficult, I knew that. But for the first time since I'd seen that devastating bank balance, I felt a glimmer of hope. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. I met with Lisa, poring over the evidence I'd gathered and discussing our options. She introduced me to a colleague who specialized in financial crimes, and together they helped me file a police report and begin the process of freezing what remained of my assets. I also reached out to a domestic violence support group, attending my first meeting with a mix of trepidation and desperation. Sitting in a circle with other survivors, listening to their stories, I felt a complex swirl of emotions. Grief for what I'd lost, anger at what had been done to me, but also a growing sense of strength and solidarity. One woman, Rebecca, took me aside after the meeting. The hardest part, she said, her eyes filled with an understanding that spoke of personal experience, is letting go of the person you thought they were. The person you loved. But remember, that person was an illusion. The real them is the one who hurt you, who betrayed you. And you deserve so much better than that. Her words stayed with me, a mantra I repeated to myself in moments of doubt. I deserved better. I was worth more than what Mark had reduced me to. As I began to rebuild my life, piece by painstaking piece, I also started to notice things I'd overlooked before. The way Mark had slowly isolated me from my friends, always with a plausible excuse. How he'd subtly undermined my confidence, his criticisms always couched in terms of concern or jokes. The times he'd gaslit me, making me doubt my own memory and perceptions. It was a painful process, re-evaluating years of memories through this new lens. But it was also empowering. With each realization, each moment of clarity, I felt myself growing stronger, more determined. One evening, about a week after I'd left our apartment, I found myself standing outside the building, staring up at the windows I used to call home. For a moment, I was overwhelmed by a wave of nostalgia and longing. How easy it would be to go up there, to try and pretend none of this had happened. But as I stood there, a gentle breeze carrying the familiar sounds and scents of the city I loved, I knew I couldn't go back. Not to Mark, not to the person I used to be. That chapter of my life was closed. Instead, I turned and walked away, my steps growing more confident with each block. I had a meeting with Lisa and the detective assigned to my case in the morning. There was still a long road ahead, full of legal battles and emotional hurdles. But for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, genuinely hopeful about the future. As I walked, I made a promise to myself. I would not let Mark's betrayal define me. I would use this experience to become stronger, wiser, more compassionate. And someday, when I had healed and grown and rebuilt my life, I would find a way to help others who had been in my position. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new, stronger chapter. The coffee shop buzzed with the low hum of conversations and the hiss of espresso machines. I sat at a corner table, my laptop open in front of me, a half-empty latte cooling at my elbow. It had been 2 weeks since I'd left the apartment, 2 weeks of emotional turmoil, sleepless nights, and slowly growing resolve. Lisa slid into the seat across from me, setting down her own cup of coffee. "All right, Ko," she said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence that had been my lifeline these past weeks. "Let's go over everything again." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Okay. So we have the bank statements showing all the withdrawals Mark made from our joint account. We have the photos of my injuries from the night I found out. And we have the police report I filed." Lisa nodded, her eyes scanning the documents spread out between us. "Good. And don't forget the text messages and emails. They might seem insignificant, but they help establish a pattern of behavior." I pulled up my phone, scrolling through the messages I'd saved. Casual lies about where he was, gaslighting responses when I'd questioned expenses, subtle put-downs disguised as jokes. Each one a small betrayal that I'd overlooked at the time, but now formed a damning picture. "I still can't believe I didn't see it," I murmured, more to myself than to Lisa. She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Hey, don't do that to yourself. Mark was manipulative and cunning. You trusted him because that's what partners are supposed to do. This is not your fault." I gave her a weak smile, grateful for her unwavering support. "Thanks, Lisa. I'm trying to remember that. It's just hard sometimes." "I know," she said softly. "But that's why we're doing this. To make sure he can't do this to anyone else, and to get you the justice you deserve." I nodded, feeling a familiar surge of determination. "Right. So, what's our next step?" Lisa leaned back, her expression turning thoughtful. "Well, we've got a solid case for financial fraud. The bank records are clear evidence of that. The domestic violence charge might be trickier to prove without witnesses, but the photos and the police report will help. I think our best bet is to push for both criminal charges and a civil suit." "Civil suit?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "Yes," Lisa explained. "Criminal charges will be pursued by the district attorney, but a civil suit allows you to seek financial compensation for what you've lost. Not just the money he stole, but also for emotional distress, potential lost wages, therapy costs, everything." The idea of putting a price tag on the pain and betrayal I'd experienced felt strange, almost wrong. But then I thought about the dreams that had been shattered, the sense of security that had been ripped away. Maybe it wasn't about the money, but about holding Mark accountable for everything he'd taken from me. "Okay," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "Let's do it. Both the criminal charges and the civil suit. I want him to face consequences for what he did." Lisa smiled, a fierce pride in her eyes. "That's my girl. Now, there's something else we need to consider. Mark might try to countersue or make false accusations against you. We need to be prepared for that." The thought sent a chill down my spine. "What kind of false accusations?" "It could be anything," Lisa said grimly. "He might claim you were the one misusing the funds, or that you assaulted him. Abusers often try to paint themselves as the victim when cornered." I felt a flicker of fear, quickly replaced by anger. "He wouldn't dare," I growled. "He might," Lisa cautioned. Which is why we need to be proactive. I want you to write down everything you can remember about your relationship. Good times, bad times, any arguments or disagreements. We need to create a comprehensive timeline. I nodded, already mentally cataloging years of memories. It would be painful, I knew, but necessary. I can do that. What else? We should reach out to friends, family, co-workers, anyone who might have witnessed your relationship dynamics. We're not just building a legal case, KO. We're reconstructing the truth that Mark tried to distort. As Lisa continued outlining our strategy, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, yes, and a lingering sadness for what I'd lost. But there was also a growing sense of empowerment. For too long, I'd been reacting to Mark's actions, always on the defensive. Now, finally, I was taking control of my own narrative. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the task of documenting my relationship with Mark. I created a detailed spreadsheet, noting down dates, events, and my recollections. It was an emotionally exhausting process, forcing me to relive both tender moments and painful arguments. But with each entry, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself that Mark had tried to erase. I also started reaching out to friends and acquaintances. Some conversations were awkward, others surprisingly supportive. My friend Jake, at whose barbecue I'd first met Mark, was particularly helpful. I always thought something was off about him, Jake admitted during a long phone call. The way he'd get possessive when you talk to other guys, how he'd make those backhanded compliments. I should have said something, KO. I'm sorry. His words were both validating and painful. It's not your fault, Jake. I didn't see it either, and I was living with him. As our case against Mark took shape, I found myself growing stronger in other areas of my life too. I'd taken a leave of absence from work to deal with everything, but now I was starting to think about the future. My boss had been surprisingly understanding when I'd finally explained the situation, and had even offered me a chance to transfer to our West Coast office if I wanted a fresh start. The idea was tempting. A new city, far away from the memories that haunted every corner of New York. But something held me back. This was my home, my battleground. Running away felt too much like letting Mark win. Instead, I decided to channel my energy into helping others. I started volunteering at the domestic violence support group I'd been attending, sharing my story and offering support to others just beginning their journey to recovery. It was hard, often heartbreaking work, but it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I was missing. One evening, as I was leaving the community center after a particularly intense group session, I ran into Rebecca, the woman who had first taken me aside and offered words of encouragement. "You're looking stronger," she said, her eyes warm with understanding. "How are you holding up?" I considered the question, realizing with some surprise that I didn't have to fake my answer. "I'm okay, actually. Better than I expected. We're moving forward with the case against Mark, and I feel like I'm finally taking back control of my life." Rebecca nodded, a hint of pride in her smile. "That's wonderful, KO. Just remember, healing isn't linear. There will still be hard days. But you've got this." As I walked home that night, Rebecca's words echoed in my mind. She was right, there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face them. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling a sense of purpose that had been absent for weeks. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat down at my laptop. It was time to write my official statement for the lawsuit. As I began typing, the words flowed more easily than I'd expected. I detailed the history of our relationship, the creation of the joint account, the gradual erosion of trust, and finally, the devastating discovery and its violent aftermath. With each paragraph, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. This was my truth, unvarnished and undeniable. When I finally finished, the sun was high in the sky, and my coffee had long since gone cold. I read through the document one last time, making small edits here and there. It wasn't just a legal statement, I realized. It was a declaration of independence, a reclamation of my own narrative. With a deep breath, I saved the document and sent it to Lisa. Then I stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. The city sprawled out before me, bustling and alive. Somewhere out there, Mark was going about his life, perhaps thinking he had gotten away with what he'd done. But not for much longer. A plan born of resolve was now in motion, and I was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead would be challenging, I knew that. But I also knew that I wasn't walking it alone. With the support of friends like Lisa and Jake, the understanding of fellow survivors like Rebecca, and my own growing strength, I was ready to face not just Mark, but whatever the future held. As I stood there, looking out at the city I'd once again come to see as home, I made a silent promise to myself and to anyone else who had ever been in my position. This wasn't just about justice for me. It was about standing up to abuse in all its forms, about reclaiming power from those who would misuse it. The journey ahead would be long, but I was ready. Ready to fight, ready to heal, and ready to help others do the same. This was more than a plan now. It was a mission, a purpose. And I was just getting started. The courthouse loomed before me, its imposing stone facade a stark contrast to the clear blue sky above. I stood on the steps, my heart pounding in my chest, Lisa's reassuring presence beside me. This was it. The day I'd been preparing for, dreading, and anxiously anticipating for months. "You ready?" Lisa asked, her voice low and steady. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my carefully chosen outfit, a simple, professional dress that made me feel both confident and protected. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, surprised by the strength in my own voice. As we climbed the steps, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed since that fateful night when I discovered Mark's betrayal. The woman I was then, broken, confused, and afraid, seemed like a stranger now. The journey hadn't been easy, filled with sleepless nights, anxiety-ridden days, and moments of doubt. But each challenge had only served to make me stronger, more determined. Inside the courthouse, the air was cool and stale, heavy with the weight of countless legal battles fought within these walls. We made our way through security and navigated the bustling corridors until we reached the designated courtroom. "Remember," Lisa said as we paused outside the heavy wooden doors, "you've done nothing wrong. You're the victim here, but more than that, you're a survivor. Hold your head high." I nodded, squaring my shoulders. We pushed open the doors and entered the courtroom. The room was already half full, the low murmur of voices creating a background hum of tension. My eyes scanned the room, and then I saw him. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his back to me. Even from behind, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight fidgeting of his hands. For a moment, I was transported back to happier times, adjusting his tie before a big meeting, massaging those same shoulders after a long day at work. The flood of memories threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed them aside. That Mark was gone, if he had ever truly existed at all. As if sensing my presence, Mark turned. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt a jolt of something. Not fear, not anymore. Not love, certainly. Perhaps it was simply recognition, the acknowledgement of two people who had once meant everything to each other, now irrevocably changed. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm that I now recognized as his defense mechanism. But there was something else there too, a flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed. Had he expected me to back down? To be too afraid or ashamed to face him in court? If so, he had underestimated me. Again. We took our seats, and the proceedings began. The judge, a stern-faced woman with piercing eyes, called the court to order. As our respective lawyers made their opening statements, I found myself drifting, the legal jargon washing over me in waves. I was snapped back to attention when it was time for me to take the stand. As I walked to the witness box, I could feel Mark's eyes on me, burning into my back. But I didn't falter. I kept my gaze straight ahead, focusing on the oath I was about to take. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff intoned. "I do," I responded, my voice clear and unwavering. As I began to recount my story, I was surprised by how calm I felt. Months of preparation, of reliving these events over and over, had taken away their power to hurt me. I spoke of our relationship, of the trust one had placed in Mark, of the joint account we had created for our future. And then, I described that night, the discovery of the empty account, Mark's violent reaction, the shattering of everything I had believed in. Throughout my testimony, I didn't look at Mark. I didn't need to. I could feel his presence, could almost sense his growing discomfort as I laid bare the truth of his actions. When I finally finished speaking, the courtroom was silent. I risked a glance at the jury and saw a mix of sympathy and anger on their faces. Mark's lawyer began his cross-examination, his tone brusque and dismissive. He tried to paint me as irresponsible with money, suggesting that I had been the one to deplete the account. He insinuated that I was vindictive, making up lies to punish Mark for leaving me. With each question, I could feel my anger rising, but I held it in check. I had prepared for this, had steeled myself against these tactics. No, I said firmly, meeting the lawyer's gaze. I did not spend that money. I did not fabricate this story. I am here because what Mark did was wrong, both legally and morally, and he needs to be held accountable. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I finally allowed myself to look at Mark. His facade of calm had cracked, revealing a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. Anger, regret, fear. Whatever it was, I realized it no longer mattered to me. My closure didn't depend on his feelings or reactions. The trial continued, with expert witnesses testifying about the financial records, the patterns of abuse, the psychological impact of such betrayal. Through it all, I sat tall, my resolve unwavering. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who had ever been betrayed, abused, or taken advantage of by someone they trusted. Finally, it was Mark's turn to testify. As he took the stand, I braced myself. Despite everything, a small part of me still hoped for, what? An apology? An explanation? I wasn't sure. Mark's testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. He spoke of misunderstandings, of good intentions gone awry. He painted himself as a devoted son and brother, claiming he had only taken the money to help his family. He even suggested that I had known about and approved of these withdrawals, but had changed my mind when our relationship soured. As I listened to his lies, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This man, whom I had loved and trusted, was truly a stranger to me. The realization was both painful and liberating. I no longer needed his approval or understanding. I no longer cared about his opinion of me. I was free. The trial stretched on for days, each one a test of endurance. But with each passing hour, I felt stronger, more certain of my path. The support of my friends, who filled the benches behind me, buoyed my spirits. Lisa's unwavering belief in me and our case kept me focused. On the final day, as we waited for the jury to return with their verdict, Lisa squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens," she said, "you've already won. You stood up for yourself. You told your truth. That's what matters." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. She was right. Regardless of the legal outcome, I had reclaimed my power. I had faced my abuser and stood my ground. I had refused to be silenced or shamed. When the jury filed back in, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. As the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, I held my breath. On the charge of grand larceny, we find the defendant, Mark Johnson, guilty. The words washed over me like a wave, bringing with them a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, vindication, a touch of sadness for what could have been. But mostly, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. As the judge read out the sentencing, jail time, restitution, a restraining order, I watched Mark. His mask had finally crumpled, revealing the scared, angry man beneath. For a moment, our eyes met again. This time, I didn't look away. I held his gaze, not with anger or hatred, but with a calm certainty. It was over. He no longer had any power over me. As we left the courthouse, the bright sunlight felt like a metaphor for my future, open, bright, full of possibility. Lisa hugged me tightly, and I could see tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," I corrected her, including not just Lisa but everyone who had supported me on this journey. As we descended the courthouse steps, I felt lighter than I had in months. The confrontation I had feared for so long was behind me. Mark would face the consequences of his actions, and I was free to move forward, to rebuild, to thrive. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that. There would still be difficult days, moments of doubt and pain. But I was no longer afraid. I had faced my worst nightmare and come out stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I could face them. As I walked away from the courthouse, away from the specter of Mark and the shadow he had cast over my life, I felt a sense of hope blooming in my chest. This wasn't an ending, I realized. It was a beginning. My beginning. And I was ready for whatever came next. The gentle spring breeze rustled through the leaves of the young maple tree I had just planted in my new backyard. I stood back, wiping the sweat from my brow, and admired my handiwork. This tree, I decided, would be a symbol of my new beginning, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing year. It had been 6 months since the trial, 6 months since I had faced Mark in court and reclaimed my life. Those months had been a whirlwind of change, challenges, and, surprisingly, joy. The journey hadn't been easy, but with each passing day, I felt more like myself, or rather, a new version of myself, stronger and wiser than before. After the trial, I had decided to take my boss up on her offer to transfer to the West Coast office. The move to San Francisco had been both terrifying and exhilarating. Leaving behind the familiar streets of New York, the support system I had built there, had been hard. But as I watched the skyline recede from the airplane window, I felt a sense of liberation. This was my chance to start fresh, to build a life entirely on my own terms. My new apartment, a cozy one-bedroom with a small yard in the Sunset District, quickly became my sanctuary. I spent the first few weeks exploring my new neighborhood, finding my favorite coffee shop, a quirky little place called the Foggy Bean, discovering hidden staircases that led to breathtaking views of the city, and slowly, cautiously, making new friends. Work became a welcome distraction and a source of pride. Throwing myself into new projects, I rediscovered my passion for marketing that had been dampened during the tumultuous months of the trial. My colleagues were welcoming, and I found myself opening up, bit by bit, sharing parts of my story when it felt right. One day, during a team lunch, my coworker Aisha asked about my move from New York. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest. I needed a fresh start, I said, my voice steady. I went through a difficult divorce and a legal battle. Coming here was my way of reclaiming my life. The table fell silent for a moment, then Aisha reached out and squeezed my hand. That must have been incredibly tough, she said. But look at you now. You're thriving. Her words, and the nods of support from my other colleagues, brought tears to my eyes. This, I realized, was what healing looked like. Being able to speak my truth without shame, and being met with understanding and support. As the months passed, I found myself slowly rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I joined a local yoga studio, finding peace and strength in the practice. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, using my experience to help others who were just beginning their journey to freedom. Each small step forward felt like a victory. But healing wasn't always a straight path. There were still nights when I'd wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by memories of Mark's betrayal. Days when the weight of what I'd been through felt overwhelming. In those moments, I leaned on the coping strategies I'd learned in therapy. I'd call Lisa, who remained a steadfast friend despite the distance. I'd go for long walks along Ocean Beach, letting the rhythm of the waves soothe my troubled mind. One sunny Saturday, about 4 months after my move, I decided to tackle a task I'd been putting off, sorting through the last of the boxes from my old life in New York. As I sifted through old photos and mementos, I came across the journal I had kept during the worst days of my ordeal. With trembling hands, I opened it, bracing myself for the pain of those raw, unfiltered emotions. Reading through those pages was like looking through a window into another life. The hurt, the anger, the fear leapt off the pages. But as I read, I realized something profound. The woman who had written those words, who had felt so broken and lost, was not me anymore. I had grown, healed, become stronger. Inspired, I grabbed a pen and turned to a fresh page. I began to write, not about the past, but about the present and the future. I wrote about my new home, my rediscovered passions, my hopes and dreams. As the words flowed, I felt a sense of lightness, of possibility. That evening, as the golden California sunset painted the sky, I sat in my small backyard, sipping a glass of wine and reflecting on how far I'd come. The sound of laughter drifted over the fence. My neighbors were having a barbecue. For a moment, I felt a pang of loneliness, a reminder of the life I'd left behind. But then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Aisha. "Hey, a bunch of us are going hiking tomorrow in Muir Woods. Want to join?" I smiled, typing back an enthusiastic yes. This was my life now, full of new experiences, new friendships, new opportunities. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself thinking less and less about Mark and the pain of the past. It wasn't that I had forgotten. Those experiences had shaped me, after all. But they no longer defined me. I was no longer a victim, or even just a survivor. I was a thriver. My financial situation, while not fully recovered, was steadily improving. The restitution ordered by the court was slowly being paid, and I had become more financially savvy, determined never to be vulnerable in that way again. I started a savings account, aptly named Dreams Fund, for future adventures and opportunities. 1 year to the day after the trial, I decided to commemorate the anniversary in my own way. I booked a solo trip to Yosemite National Park, a place I'd always wanted to visit but had never found the time or courage to explore alone. As I stood at the top of Glacier Point, looking out over the vast, awe-inspiring landscape, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, standing on the steps of the courthouse, terrified but determined. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that everything would be okay. That she was stronger than she knew. That there was a beautiful life waiting for her on the other side of this struggle. As I watched the sun set over Half Dome, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I made a decision. It was time to truly let go of the past. Not to forget it, but to accept it as part of my journey and move forward unburdened. Back in San Francisco, energized by my Yosemite epiphany, I threw myself into new pursuits. I signed up for a creative writing class at the local community college, rediscovering a passion I'd abandoned years ago. I joined a hiking group, challenging myself to explore more of the beautiful landscapes around the Bay Area. And, tentatively, I dipped my toes back into the dating pool. My first date postmark was with a kind-eyed teacher named James, whom I met at a fundraiser for the women's shelter. As we sat across from each other at a cozy Italian restaurant, which reminded me, with a bittersweet pang, of Mama Rosa's back in New York, I found myself opening up about my past. To my surprise, sharing my story felt empowering rather than frightening. James listened with compassion, then shared some of his own struggles. As the evening went on, I realized that while I might not be ready for a serious relationship, I was ready to connect with people again, to be vulnerable, to trust. As spring turned to summer, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The young maple tree in my backyard was flourishing, its leaves a vibrant green against the blue California sky. Like that tree, I too was putting down roots, growing stronger every day. One warm evening, as I sat on my small patio, laptop open as I worked on a short story for my writing class, my phone buzzed with a news alert. I glanced at it absently, then froze. The headline read, "New York businessman convicted of fraud faces additional charges." My heart raced as I clicked on the article. There was Mark's face, looking older and harder than I remembered. According to the report, he had been involved in a series of fraudulent schemes beyond what he had done to me. For a moment, I felt a complex mix of emotions, anger, vindication, and a strange sort of pity. But as I read on, I realized something important. This news, which once would have sent me into a tailspin of anxiety and bitter memories, now felt distant. It was a part of my past, but it no longer had the power to disrupt my present or threaten my future. I closed the news app and returned to my writing. The story I was working on, a tale of resilience and rebirth, suddenly took on new meaning. I wrote late into the night, the words flowing easily, carrying with them the weight of my experiences and the lightness of my hope for the future. As I finally closed my laptop and got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had fled New York a year ago. This woman stood tall, her eyes clear and determined, a small smile playing on her lips. This woman was a survivor, yes, but more than that, she was a warrior, a phoenix risen from the ashes of her past. I climbed into bed, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for how far I'd come and excitement for what lay ahead. The journey hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more challenges to face. But I was ready for them. I was ready for whatever life had in store. As I drifted off to sleep, my last thought was of that maple tree in the backyard. By this time next year, it would be taller, stronger, its roots reaching deep into the earth. And so would I. This was just the beginning of my new story, and I couldn't wait to see how it would unfold.